everyone, and thank you for joining MetaverseXpress Full Stop, where we hit the brakes to discuss hot topics in the metaverse. My special guest today is a good friend of mine. He's a Web3 gaming content creator, a gamer himself, and an Alluvium Council member. I mean, those are the few things I know. I'm sure there's more. We call him Annie, and that's short for, you know what, Annie? I hope I say this right, but it is ANIMOSITAS, right?
You nailed it. That was perfect,
See?
Mona. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
feel like it's like it was a little Spanish in there. But
Exactly.
he's going to tell us what that means in just a minute, but I'm so excited to have him here today on the show. Annie, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Mona. It's really a privilege. I've been a fan of your content, and we met at some point middle of last year,
Yeah.
and just started talking and had a chance to do several shows together. And really, just being able to see the space evolve over the last year or so has been very exciting. I'm really pleased at some of the casts that we're going to be working on together going forward, and really glad to be joining the first time with the rest of your audience today.
The feeling is so mutual. For those of you who don't know, I truly consider Annie a true expert when it comes to, I know he's going to be humble about it, but he really is when it comes to gaming, crypto and Web3. And whenever there's like, I'm stumped on a complicated concept, you're the first person I think of to call for an answer. And there's a reason right next to your name, it says Annie knows. Because
Yes.
Annie really does know. And that's exactly why you're here on the show today. We have a complicated topic that we're going to discuss. You know, I've been wanting to talk about this for a long time on the channel, but you really need somebody, some of these crypto concepts, you really need to break them down to bite-sized pieces. So that's what I kind of want us to do today. I want us to talk about this concept of a DAO, which is an acronym that stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, which we know is such an integral part of Web3 and crypto and gaming as well now. And I thought you would be the best person to come. And, you know, as you know, my viewers are non-crypto natives for the most part. For those who are crypto natives, we're going to do another session where we'll do more in-depth cases. But I thought the first time that we're going to introduce DAOs, we should start very easy and slow and kind of break it down in small little bite-sized pieces. And I think you're the best candidate for that.
Well, thank you. I think the topic is super interesting. When we talk about how people work and coordinate together, DAOs are one of the really most interesting experiments that I think we've seen in several decades at least. And so really excited to break it down with you today. So yeah, let's hop right in and help our audience
Sure.
figure out what is this DAO concept and what do I need to know? Maybe I want to join a DAO. Maybe I should run away from DAOs when I hear them hear them discussed. So
It
there's
is.
good, there's bad, and there's ugly at times too. But like anything, it's got a lot of potential in Web3.
Oh my gosh. And in just our physical world too, it's such a fascinating concept. And I think as AI evolves as well, we're going to see a lot of the concept of DAO kind of translating into how we structure our businesses in the real world. And again, you know, this is very nascent. It's a very nascent phase that we're still in. And I think we're still trying to define not what DAOs are, but what is that perfect structure of a DAO. We're going to talk about all that, but maybe let's start from the very beginning. What in the world does a decentralized autonomous organization even mean, Annie? Give it to us.
Yeah. So when I talk about DAOs, I like to think of really three key elements that are important to a DAO. The first is that you've got a digital virtual group of people that are all connected, right? So these individuals then have some sort of a shared purpose that they're working towards as a group. And they have a structure that's governed by code and leveraging some form of a token, typically, to where they're working together towards their common purpose, but in a way that's being done through the power of computing, as opposed to through all of them coming into a room together and having a big discussion and voting on something in person. Instead, they're doing all of those activities in a global, time zone free sort of space where you're trying to get a lot of people together to organize in an effective way. And so those are some of the key elements that when I think about a DAO, you need to have present.
Mhm.
Um, as far as like what is it really trying to accomplish? I always like to go back to the why. So why does a DAO exist in the first place? What is that underlying problem that people are trying to solve? And it
Mhm.
really comes down to getting a group of people to organize in a way that aligns all of their interests together. So
Right.
this concept of stakeholder alignment is a really important one. And we see this oftentimes in governments. We see it in corporate organizations, in nonprofits, in public goods space, where you have a lot of different stakeholders that have concerns about a particular topic, and you really want them to be moving in the same direction, to be fundamentally aligned in how they're proceeding. And this is what DAOs are intended to solve. They're not a perfect solution, but they do have some really interesting components that I think make it preferable a lot of times to other types of organizational structures.
I try to kind of, when I look at DAOs, I try to break it down by using some real life scenarios and what do we see today that could be structured that way. I mean, obviously, based on what you said, we have this organization that's run by codes and smart contracts that perform these tasks, which are agreed upon by the people who, say, started the DAO. Keeping that in mind, could you expand on how a DAO really works by giving us maybe a real world analogy?
Sure. So one that I like to think of is most of your audience is probably familiar with the concept of a credit union. So if
Mhm.
they're not, a credit union is basically a group of people that get together to form an organization like a bank. And they say, okay, we're going to come together. We're not going to be structured as a bank, but we're all going to basically pool our resources, and we're going to operate together as this single kind of unified entity that's steering this financial organization for the betterment of our customers. And the key difference is that while a bank is going to go out and try and get new customers, they don't really care where the customers come from. Their goal is to make money for the owners of the bank. A credit union is actually owned by the members of the credit union. So
Mhm.
instead of having that disconnect where the owners of the organization are different from the users of the organization, in the
Mhm.
case of a credit union, they're the same. And so if the users of the credit union, the customers, think that they need to change some form of operations in the organization, they're also the owners and have the ability to do so, again, based on their
Mhm.
voting power, that and the structures that they've set up. So it really does a good job of aligning the incentives behind the owners and the customers. And so I think a credit union is a really good example of how in the common world today we would see an organization structured similarly to how a DAO works.
That's a great example. Now, if you take that in the case of big companies like Apple or Netflix, right? They all have board meetings, I would say, and in these board meetings, shareholders of the companies vote on decisions for the company, right? And then the CEOs make sure those decisions are followed through, basically. But in a DAO, in the example you gave, there are no CEOs, correct? So once a decision is made, then it has to, that decision has to be a code, correct?
Yeah, so it has to be implemented in some way. And this is a big difference where in traditional organizations, when you have a stakeholder or shareholder voting entities, they're typically going to vote for a person, and they're going to say, okay, I believe that Mona is going to be the best CEO for this organization. I'm going to vote for her. And then it's her responsibility and maybe a team of people working with her to implement the decisions of the
Right.
organization, to implement and execute on the mission of the group, whatever it is, right? If it's a bank, your job is to set up all the financial structures, go out and get customers, make sure you're balancing, risk and liquidity and all of that. In a DAO structure, though, you're not really voting for people generally. There are some representative structures in DAOs, but more commonly, you're voting for a decision. You'll often hear these spoken about as like an improvement protocol. And what that means is you're going to be asked a question as a voter in a DAO. Do you think we should do thing X? And you're going to vote yes or no. And maybe there's some different options for it. Once you vote that, though, there's going to be some number of individuals who are responsible then for taking the details of that decision and then implementing it in code on the blockchain. And so in this case, you're going to, instead of electing people to make decisions and to run the organization, you're basically just passing through the direction, the strategy, the purpose into some individuals who are turning it into code and then letting that run on its own, so that you no longer have to worry about, oh, well, we elected Mona, but she's not doing such a great job as the CEO. Now we need to replace her, or we need to go in a different direction as for our strategy as an organization. So that's kind of the fundamental difference in how you're going to be using code to implement directions from the DAO, as opposed to using people to make decisions and implement.
That's so crazy. That's so fascinating. I mean, they don't even need us anymore. We don't even need to voice. I mean, they still need us to voice their opinion and give those, I guess, directions to code. And because I guess what I was going to ask you was, how is a code can't improve itself? So how do DAOs continually improve and grow? And the answer to that is, you still need the people, right, to make those decisions,
right.
to then put it in smart contracts, right?
That's right. So at least today, we're sitting here in January of 2023, and I reserve the right to retract this statement at any point. But right now, the smart contracts can't improve themselves enough that they don't really need people yet. So as you mentioned, with advances in AI, there's possibilities that we could see, and we can see, some early stage examples of sort of self-improving code. But to take a really complex topic that a DAO would be voting on and figure out how to implement that yourself, I'm not aware of any engines that are really in development right now in the AI space or otherwise that would have that capability. So for the time being, you're still going to need software developers to be able to translate the decision into the technical realm. And you're also still going to need people to vote, because at the end of the day, it's around aligning incentives for people so that they can work together in a broader organization. And so the shareholders of a DAO are really the essential factor here that makes it all work, because they control, however the voting mechanism is set up, they control the future of the organization in a way that's much closer to its reality than in a lot of other organizations, to be honest with you.
When you were talking, I'm thinking, wow, in a business that's very mechanically driven, like let's say engineering or car factories or NASA, I can totally see that the AI or the code will take a look at the engineering that's been done and make those suggestions and corrections, right? So that's really fascinating to me when it comes to making correction in those areas. But then I'm also thinking, like, I use the HOA example a lot. I feel like in some areas you still need human and people to assess certain situations and then make recommendations. You know what I mean? So I think in one hand, an AI or the coder smart contract could make all those suggestions, but then there's going to be cases where you still need people, right? If we're thinking and talking 10 years from now.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's even true today with a lot of DAOs. So I mentioned earlier on, some DAOs are like just a pure democratic type of approach where you're going to vote on a decision, and every shareholder within that DAO has the ability to give their position on a specific improvement protocol, you'll vote and it will pass or it will be rejected.
Mm.
Other DAOs are set up with a more, let's say, representative model. So in the same way that you see in governments, you'll, instead of voting on a particular change point, you'll vote to elect someone. A council was what they're typically called, a group of representatives to basically have the best interest of the DAO in mind. Those individuals are going to get much more into the detail on all of the topics that are coming up in front of the DAO. They're going to look at the overall strategy, data analytics, to a level that thousands of potential DAO members wouldn't have the time to do, and they're
Mhm.
then going to vote and make some of these decisions on behalf of the rest of the members of the DAO. So you see both different approaches. I think both can work. It really just depends on what is the purpose of the DAO. What are you trying to solve for? How complex is the project that you're running? A very simple sort of
Mhm.
financial protocol might be easy enough for the typical DAO member to see a proposal and decide, yes, we want to increase this, this number from 3 to 4%. Simple enough.
Mhm.
But if you want someone to go do detailed market research and come up with your go-to-market strategy for a brand new product in a new sector like gaming, you probably need people that are a little bit more specialized than just your average voter that holds tokens in that particular project. So I think you need to
Mhm.
just solve for what is the purpose of your organization, and then set up the structure based on that.
And we're going to get into tokenomics with DAOs because that's where shit gets complicated. Sorry, but it's true. You had me until tokenomics kicked in because now we're like, wait, there's money involved too. But before I ask you about tokenomics, do you think the banking system is a perfect model for DAOs? Because I feel like they are.
I think at a minimum, it's a very good one. It's a good use case. You have very clear alignment in terms of the purpose of financial organizations. One challenge that we often see with DAOs is they can get a little bit too unfocused. If
Mm.
you don't have a very clear mission, you don't have a very clear sort of market value standpoint, market value proposition, and in financial institutions, it's usually pretty straightforward. And so
Mm.
I think that lends itself well to a DAO structure. You've got that common purpose. You obviously have a group of individuals that are going to want to be investing together. You can pretty easily structure the code. There's a lot of good examples today of DAOs that are built in DeFi that are able to basically be copied. This is the advantage. A lot
Mm.
of it's open source too, so you aren't having to create it from scratch. So I think a lot of current financial institutions could make the shift to move to a DAO structure. Now, again, there's pros and cons. We can talk about some of the disadvantages of DAOs too,
Mhm.
but that is a very easy use case to see, and I think it makes it transparent why a lot of DeFi protocols are set up as DAOs from the beginning, right now. And it's not really just about securities laws and regulation and compliance. It's really about the governing structures being more effective for DeFi protocols set up as DAOs, as opposed to as a centralized entity.
I mean, we could go down crazy rabbit holes with this because I mean, like you said, it just depends on what genre we're talking about where
Mhm.
DAOs can be applied, right? Because I mean, when I look at DAOs and I think they can be applied in news media, where you get a group of people that have shared interest on news media and they kind of come together to decide what the network is going to air basically.
Mhm.
So I think there's just depends really on the genre, and we're going to talk about the pros and cons because I also want to talk about how does a DAO affect the end product, right? If your product is gaming, and we have people making votes and dictating the direction of your product, does it affect that product in any way, positive or negative? So we're going to hold that thought because we're going to come back to that. But before we go there, I want to talk about tokenomics because in the world of crypto, DAOs typically launch with a few million tokens. What is the role of these tokens in the structure of a DAO, and how can you tell us how are they used?
Mhm. Yeah, so again, it can depend on the project, but generally speaking, DAO is going to launch tokens that are going to be used by all of the members of the organization. And so if you want to join a DAO, let's say that you believe in the mission of this particular organization, you say, I want to be a part of DAO XYZ, you're going to go out and buy their token. Let's say it's token XYZ. And you can do that through usually just a token swap from USDC or Ether or Bitcoin or whatever. And once you own some of those tokens, you effectively become a member. That's your pass into be a part of the DAO organization. And once you are in, having those tokens also is going to allow you to vote, generally speaking. So all of the members of a DAO, once you have these decisions that are going to come up and you need to set a strategic direction, you need to decide on future products or launch dates or whatever it might be, all of the token holders are given the opportunity to vote on those proposals. Typically, a proposal is going to be submitted by any other token holder. So someone who's a part of the DAO can write up a document and say, here's the change that we want to make. And then there's usually some kind of approval process. Does it have at least a minimum number of support levels within the community? And once it hits that threshold, it's going to go to a vote for some period of time, anywhere from a day to a week to a month. All of the token holders then have the chance to vote on it, and then it's decided yes or no. And so these tokens are essentially your voting right, if you will, to vote as a member of the DAO. And so there's different ways that the voting can be calculated, but fundamentally that's what you're doing, is you're sharing in the responsibility of the decision making for the DAO.
So then if the DAO is profitable, the shareholders get redistribution from that profit. So the profit along with the voting rights make holding that token more valuable, right?
Yeah, generally that's true. I would say when we're thinking about DAOs, it is important to recognize that there's two common elements that are put together in most DAOs that we see today, but they don't have to be. You've got the governance structure, which is what I just kind of described with the voting process and setting the direction of the organization. You then, on the other hand, have the financial aspects and incentives. Most organizations, they have a single token structure where you get the token, you gain access to basically some share of the finances of the organization through distribution processes and price appreciation of the token, and you also get the governance structure on the other hand. And so there's a couple of reasons for this. One of those is security regulations. Another one is, again, just trying to align the incentives behind the financial backers and owners of a project with the decision making. So oftentimes those are put together, but again, they don't necessarily have to be. We could think of probably a number of public goods or not-for-profit groups that might set up a DAO. So let's say that your school board wants to be run as a DAO, and all of the parents of the children, we believe, should have a right to give their opinions on different key decisions that are facing the school board. You might give a token to every parent for one vote, basically, for any key topics that come up for that school district. That token isn't presumably going to appreciate in value per se, and probably parents are not going to be selling their votes to other people on the open market. So they don't really care about the financial aspect of it. They're really concerned about the governance side. So that's one good example I can think of where we don't have to have those two elements together, but in most cases they are generally linked today, especially in DeFi.
Do you have to have tokens attached, or can a DAO be without a token and just focus on the voting system? Or is that because the DAO needs to fund itself? Really, that's what it comes down to, right?
Yeah. So I think you probably, unless you're setting up a DAO where basically the membership is open, which is possible, but it would be a little bit strange because, again, you presumably want people to have a shared reason for being in the DAO together, as opposed to anyone that wanders by can vote. You need some sort of gating mechanism to say who should be able to vote in our organization. And And so tokens are the easiest way to do that. Again, it's pretty simple to spin one up. When I say tokens, it could be both fungible or non-fungible tokens. I think probably most of our audience has at least heard those terms, meaning basically it's like just a coin, or it could be a more specific token, like, a picture, a JPEG of something. So either one of those types of tokens can be used for gating purposes to say, Annie and Mona are members of this particular DAO. So that's really where you commonly need to have a token in place. You could come up with other ways to basically gate the structure. But what I would say is it's probably easiest just to set up a simple token that maybe is even non-transferable. It's soul bound to a particular wallet, and you get it if you don't really want to deal with people trading tokens and swapping them and so on. But you do want to have some way of making sure that you know who is actually participating in your voting activity.
So would financial companies like banks, or let's say Netflix, or, well, it's not a financial company, but let's say Ameritrade, like, could they implement DAOs, and how would that work?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Could they? Absolutely. Would they choose to? Probably not. And the reason is you've got a lot of stakeholders, namely all of the employees of the organization, that if you were to implement a DAO structure, a lot of those key decision makers would effectively lose 100% of their power of their roles,
Mm,
and presumably a lot of their compensation is based on them making decisions for the betterment of their organization, right? If
mm,
Ameritrade, you're going to have a CEO who is setting the strategy and the direction. So
mm,
to take a centralized organization like a bank in this case and to convert it to a DAO means you're basically removing the power of the centralized entities and giving it to a decentralized group of people, basically, the owners, the customers of that bank. So it
mhm,
could certainly happen, but it would be probably a pretty painful process for a lot of people that have a lot of skin in the game. And so it's more likely
mm,
you would see maybe a child organization spun out of one of those, and instead of converting the entire existing structures, you would say we're going to create a new structure that we're going to basically fund as a spin-off or a startup, as
mm.
opposed to just basically blowing up the entire structure of an existing organization.
Right. I mean, it is very much power back to the people. It's giving the power back to the people. And I guess you kind of have to look at who's structured better for that, because I do see that companies now in Web 2 and in our physical world can some companies can really take advantage of this. I know there's a coffee shop in Seattle that's working strictly with the DAO model. Are there some instances that you can think of that you think are just perfect for this structure and setup?
Yeah, I think the easiest way for Web 2 traditional companies to move in this direction is a loyalty program. It's a
Mm,
very simple model that already exists in Web 2. And if you were to implement that as effectively a DAO, you're giving not just rewards back to your frequent customers and your most valued, your valued partners, you're also giving them some say in the running of your business and your organization. And so that's where it goes a little bit beyond just pure token and financial structures and incentives, where a loyalty program is really just designed to make sure that people keep coming back and buying more of your product, right?
mhm,
But if you were to implement as a DAO, um, you also give power to people to say, oh, what's the new product that we should begin offering this time next year that we need to develop, right?
mhm.
Maybe there's a particular pumpkin latte that you really want at that coffee shop, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
and you as the customers are going to get a chance to vote on it, right?
Mm.
Web 2 organizations do this all the time. They have voting processes, and
Yeah.
they say all of our customers can use this QR code, scan it, and you're going to be able to vote for what particular color of a marshmallow is going to go into this box of cereal next, right? So
Right.
we do this all the time as customers. We want to feel like we're a part of the organization, that we have some
Yes.
say in what they're doing, that we're not just there for the organization to make money, but that they care about what we think. And
Mhm.
if you actually have the ability to vote and give input into decisions, even if they're not super critical decisions, I mean, blue or green isn't probably going to make or break Lucky Charms, but at the end of the day, it's something that attaches me more strongly to your brand. You can
Mhm.
see that same model applying in different ways across Web 2. And the stronger you make that, again, loyalty program is the starting point, but you could go much further if you wanted to. You're building that connection between your customers and the organization.
And that's really what it's about. At the end of the day, you would just want to make people feel like they are a part of this process, and you're building brand loyalty. That's what it looks like to me. And there's definitely, I mean, we're talking about this because it's DAOs are very interesting, and there's definitely some their benefits, but it's a double-edged sword. There's also, some downfalls and risks as well, and we see in this space that there are DAOs that are struggling, especially on the financial side, which we'll get into that as well. But maybe let's kind of break down a little bit the benefits and the risks. Let's start with the benefits. I know we talked about some of them, and I mean, you can hear what the benefits are as well, but some specific stuff that DAO offers. First and foremost, is trustless, correct? How do you describe that trustlessness of a DAO?
Yeah, so that's kind of the example I gave where if you vote for a person to represent you in an organization, you're trusting that they're going to do the right thing. And
Mhm.
when we look at contracts in Web 2, we're trusting that people are going to do the right thing. In a DAO type of structure, you don't really have to trust other people to do the right thing. Once you get the decisions made translated into code, which of course requires some software capabilities, that code is going to execute on the blockchain whether you like it or not. Right. So again, double-edged sword, but that code, everyone can see it and everyone can trust that it's going to continue executing in general from one block to the next, day and night, 24/7. So that code is not going to get tired. It's not going to have a conflict of interest with another organization. It's not going to decide that the strategy is wrong. It's just going to keep executing. And so the advantage of using code comes because it's going to continue in the same way. Whether it's immutable or it's changeable doesn't really matter. You can see what it's going to be doing all the way into the future. And so you can have confidence that when you take an action, you know what the counteraction is going to be on the blockchain based on what you did, as opposed to people who are notoriously unreliable and unpredictable.
I was just thinking those files that sit on people's desks. No more. No more.
Indeed. Yes.
Shit's gonna actually get done, everybody.
Mhm.
Another
That's
cool
right.
thing, another cool thing about DAOs is a DAO can't be shut down. Like you can't just close the door, shut it down, right? I mean, is that a blessing or a curse? I don't know. It might be a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Explain that to us.
Yeah, for sure. So actually, I was having a discussion last night with some of my fellow council members in Illuvium about the DAO structure, and we made this exact point that if something happens to an individual in a DAO, that the organization is going to continue on essentially still running as long as there are some members of the DAO that believe in its mission and are able to keep going forward. It can keep moving. In a typical organization, when you remove a key player, you remove the CEO, all of a sudden the organization starts to freeze up,
Mm.
and you don't get a lot of the dynamic movement that you need to keep progressing and growing. In a DAO, though, you can remove any of these component parts, and you've got still hundreds or thousands of people, depending on the size of the DAO, that are going to keep pushing forward because they have that shared vision for what they're creating and what they're building together.
I mean, it's pretty awesome. I mean, you mentioned the open source, which again, speaking of double-edged sword, there's a blessing and curse in having an open source data as well. And that kind of leads me into the downsides. Let's talk about some of those downsides. Firstly, that open source can make a DAO vulnerable, right? Talk to us about some of the vulnerabilities that come with that open sourceness.
Absolutely. So being fully transparent um, is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in that all of your members can see what you're up to, but that
Mhm.
also means that everyone else can see what you're up to as well. And so that's true whether you're an organization that has some particular secrets or strategy elements that you would rather not
Mm.
reveal to the general public at large. You may have competitors that would really like to know what your upcoming moves are going to be. And if you're discussing that as a DAO, anyone can obviously purchase one of your tokens and come join the group and get that information. And so you no longer have really any degree of confidentiality of
Mhm.
the group. So that's one downside of a DAO. Additionally, if there's someone that wants to cause mischief or they have cross purposes that they're working towards, you're much more vulnerable to attacks from those individuals as a DAO because, again, everything is fully open source. And we see some of the, I would say, most high profile cases where DAOs did not succeed. They were hacked or they had some other technical vulnerability that was exploited that
Mhm.
allowed someone to either basically pull out a lot or all of the funding from the DAO, or that allowed them to basically break the structure of the organization in such a way that it couldn't be put back together. And so that's kind of the risk of having all of your strengths open to the public, is you also have all of your weaknesses open to the public.
That's huge though. I mean, what do you do about that? Because I mean, if everyone can see that code, hackers can see that code and they can manipulate that code. Is there anything that you can do, any work around that? Or is that's just we haven't solved that yet?
So I would say that there are things that you can do to mitigate that. I
Mhm.
don't know that there's a perfect solution. Things that you can approach or topics that you can approach this with, you can get the support of your communities. So oftentimes you'll see what we call hackers, who are basically people who are trying to find vulnerabilities within your code that are doing so with your best intentions in mind. And
Mhm.
most large DAOs are going to basically put a bounty program up and say, if anyone in our community raises awareness for us of a vulnerability so that we can fix it and it's not exploited by someone else, we're going to pay them some amount of money based on them doing so in an altruistic way, as opposed to using that knowledge to maybe pull money down for themselves. So
Mm.
engaging your community is a powerful thing. And certainly, you can also engage professionals. So a lot of DAOs, and just like any kind of smart contract, you're going to want to have audits that are put in place to make
Mhm.
sure that you have consistency in the code, that you have your vulnerabilities closed. And it's not a perfect solution, but that's certainly one element. The third one, it gets back to one of the core principles of technology, which is the longer you have something running and the longer you have something open to attack, and the longer that it goes on without being attacked, the more confident you can be in its overall security.
Mm.
And this, it kind of sounds like it's almost a tautology, or or something where well, of course that's the case, but you can actually prove that this is true based on the likelihood of a particular attack occurring, as there's value accruing to the organization. And so if you have real money sitting there in an open, let's say you have money sitting in the back seat of your car and you leave the windows open, the longer that you do that, the more likely it is that they're going to be stolen, by someone who's walking by, right? So if you leave your windows open for 2 minutes and then you come back after running into a building, you're probably still going to have your money there. But if you leave it there overnight, you're probably going to be out of luck.
Mhm.
If you weren't sure if your windows were open or not, and you come back out and it's been 5 days, if your money's there, you can be pretty sure that your windows were closed.
Mhm.
And it's that same logic when you think about it from a code security standpoint, where you're not sure that your code is perfect, but the fact that no one has been able to break your model
Mm.
makes it much more likely, the longer you go, that it's pretty good.
So self-policing and auditing sounds like the ways that you can mitigate this to me. right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And again, there are different ways that you can structure voting to make sure that you can also protect from some types of like ownership attacks. Like in Web 2, we often think of hostile takeovers from one company to another. That concept can exist in a DAO structure as well, but there are different methods that you can take to try and mitigate those risks as well.
Self custody goes all the way into self custody, self policing.
Mhm.
It's very people driven, it sounds like, very computer driven and very people driven, which it sounds like that's the direction we're going. One of the topics when we talk about DAOs and their downside, and I think we've talked about this when it comes to gaming, we've asked this questions: are DAOs really decentralized? When you look at, and that's earlier when I was saying tokens kind of mess everything up, at least the way I look at it is I've always asked, when a few holders who hold the majority of the token or tokens make most of the decisions, how does that affect the product? Right. And then at that point, is it now about really the product, or is it about the investor's pocket? Right. So this is a very gray area or a fine line that we often talk about. And you always gave me a very good answer. You kind of can break that down. Well, our DAOs are really decentralized, and how do tokenomics affect that concept?
Yeah, I think this question, are DAOs really decentralized, is probably the most common criticism that I hear. And there's a lot of truth to it, right? It depends on the specific project, the number of tokens, the structure, the voting structure. Um, if you have too much centralization of tokens in a small number of holders, you can get negative outcomes for sure. And what I would say is projects that have substantial numbers, either for early stage investors like pre-seed or seed round investors, your VCs, for instance, or angel investors, uh, projects that give too many tokens to the team and or advisors and are not really decentralized from a number standpoint, those I think over time tend to do not very well, because really you're losing the advantages of having your customers and the rest of your community involved in your decision making process, and you're basically just using it as a financial instrument. So I don't see that as really that much different than Web 2. Um, but you're basically, I guess, trying to get credit for being more decentralized than you actually are. There are some things that projects can do to try and address that. And I've mentioned different voting mechanisms. One of the most popular is called quadratic voting. And basically, if you think about two different holders, one person has 100 tokens and one person has 4 tokens. Well, you need 25 people that have 4 tokens to equal the voting power of that one individual that has 100, right? So in most cases, you would assume it's going to be impossible for smaller holders of the tokens to be able to have any meaningful say. And
Mm-hmm.
that's generally right when you use a traditional voting mechanism. In quadratic voting, you basically take the square root of the number of tokens that someone holds. And so the first person that has 100 tokens, they have a voting power of 10. The
Mm-hmm.
second person that has 4 tokens has a voting power of 2.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 10 and 2 are still different, right? The person that has 100 tokens still has 5 times the voting power of the person that has 4.
Mm-hmm.
But what they don't have is 25 times. And so that's a method that you can use to try and more normalize the number of tokens and the voting strength of an individual that has a stronger financial interest, but you say they shouldn't have that outsized of a governance interest in the protocol.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one good example of how we see a lot of projects try and mitigate that risk. Um, I would say also that one key point that is often overlooked is recognizing that statistically the number of people that actually participate in an election in a DAO is oftentimes less than what we see even in normal governmental voting in the real world, right? When you go to
Mm-hmm.
vote for your state, your federal, your local governments, um, most countries, again, it varies depending on laws and jurisdictions, but they're going to have somewhere between like 30 and 60, 70% of their populace that's going to vote.
Mhm.
DAOs often are even lower than that. And so again, you kind of get to that, is it really decentralized if only 15% of our holders are voting?
Mhm.
What I would say is you can look at it statistically in this way. Imagine that you had 1,000 holders in your DAO. If only one of them actually voted on a proposal, you would say it's not really decentralized. If the other 999 just ignored the change entirely, maybe they didn't care about it, whatever reason, you would say it's not really decentralized. In the same way, if 999 people voted and only one person didn't vote because they were unable to do so, you would say that's very decentralized, right? I mean,
Mhm.
probably the votes of the 999 were pretty similar in outcome to if all 1,000 people voted.
Mhm.
So it's somewhere on this continuum, and you would say, well, if we're far enough on one end, it's probably decentralized enough, whatever that means. If we're way on the other end, it's not really decentralized. Um, I would say that you often can assume, in general, most DAOs will have enough people participating, if it's an active community, if the project is still actually running, that they're going to represent the broader cross section of holders.
Mhm.
And again, it's the same reason that polling often works to pretty close order of magnitude for what you're going to see when you actually have everyone vote. So you can use statistics to tell you what is the actual level of decentralization you need in terms of voting to really reflect the opinions of the entire organization.
Wow. Phew. I mean, it sounds like quadratic voting would have to be implemented in a lot of these cases because I mean, I can see that being the case, and we do see that being the case. Which when you were talking, I was actually thinking about something else too, and I think we talk about this in gaming. I'm going to use gaming as an example. When we have a gaming DAO, let's say Alluvium, is everyone who a token holder, are they all gamers? And do they all know about the development of a game, right? And the reason I ask that is because what kind of vote are they? Do they have to have any credentials to be a voter, or are you just a token holder and you don't know anything about gaming and you're essentially dictating or guiding the direction of the product? So can anyone just vote, and you can come from any walk of life and know about the product or don't know about the product and then shape the direction of that game in this example?
Yeah. So there's two. I think that you hit on two really good elements. One is the actual implementation of the projects, and the second one is sort of the knowledge and understanding of the voters. So let me unpack those in two steps. In most projects, you don't want the people that are voting on the direction of the DAO to be the ones that are also implementing the project, right? So
Mm.
just because I hold a token doesn't mean that I know anything about software development. It doesn't mean I know anything about marketing. It doesn't mean I know anything about business development. And so you're often still going to need a team or a group of contributors who are specialized, who have those skills, who are actually the ones implementing, and executing on the mission of the DAO. The token holders are generally going to give the vision and the direction for those team members to actually operate. And so having some sort of wall between the two to where you might have overlap. So it's probably a good thing if the team members are also token holders because they're invested in the project. But you don't want people who are just voting to be dictating exactly how something should be done. You more want them to be saying what should be done and let the experts actually go do it on their own. So that's kind of one key point, whether it's game design, whether it's a financial protocol design, whether it's software development, take your pick. Any of those, we need to separate the implementation from the strategy and direction. On
Mhm.
the other side, the question, do voters in a DAO have the right knowledge to be able to give the correct vision and direction? The answer, I think, is probably mixed. If you assume that the voters are trying to solve for, I want value to accrue to the project, which means really by definition, we're going to have a better product that goes out. We're going to have more customers that want to use it. Their incentives are at least aligned to the betterment of, of the protocol. The question, do they have the right short versus long-term incentives, is a good one. And do they have the right knowledge to even know if what they're voting on is the right decision or not? That's where I think you can get into this concept of having a representative DAO. Can make sense to say, hey, I'm just a token holder here. I have no knowledge of, of game development. And so I'm not going to give you feedback on what's the right genre that we should be building next in our project. I have no idea if a first person shooter is better than a MOBA, but I'm going to trust somebody does. And I'm going to try and figure out who that person is and vote for them to then, make those decisions on behalf of the DAO. In the same way, excuse me, in the same way, I think you're able to kind of get the best of both worlds. If you have token holders that are able to have a broad community that they're involved with, that they can discuss topics with, and then from that community, they can pull some of those knowledgeable individuals and have them represent the rest of the project, in the DAO structure. So there's, and there, bear with me. So there's one other point that I want to mention, and it's in my mind the biggest risk that we see with a lot of DAOs, which is the incentives of the shareholders, of the token holders, often mean that they might vote for something that's better for them from a financial standpoint, but is worse for the customers of the product. We see the same in Web 2, where, and I like to tell people, if you see an organization promote their CFO to CEO, you should immediately exit, because within 5 years, that organization is going to be flailing. Finance people are not operations people. They don't know product and they don't know customers. And so that's almost always a terrible mistake, unless the person came from operations and they landed in the finance arm of the organization. But generally speaking, you want to see organizations that take the customer's feedback into account. And this is where I think a lot of DAOs need to at times consider shifting to where it's not necessarily just token holders that have input. It's customers, those people that are using the product. And so there's different ways you can solve for that. But that, in my mind, is actually the biggest and often overlooked risk of DAOs, depending on what the type of organization is.
Wow, and it's some amazing points here. Thank you for breaking it down and sharing that with us. I mean, you're in the midst of it. You're a council member at Illuvium, so you're in the gaming side of DAOs. Even though your knowledge extends way past that, what are you seeing in, let's say, in the example of Illuvium? What's working really well in the Illuvium DAO, and what are some areas that you see will need work, and that we still need to work on? What are you excited about?
Yeah, so I'm really excited right now. It's a fun time to be on the Illuvium Council, because we're actually undergoing major changes to our governance structure. So we have what we call governance version 1, which is basically a 5-person representative council, as you mentioned, that I sit on, that helps set the strategy of Illuvium as a project. We're in the process, and we have a current draft of what we call governance version 2 that's out today, that instead implements multiple levels of councils. And so we'll still have a primary council, but there are going to be specialized sub-councils that focus on game mechanics and marketing and strategy and community involvement. And all of those sub-councils, then we're going to be electing people that should have very specialized knowledge into those areas to then represent the rest of the Illuvium token holders. And from that, what I anticipate we're going to see is, first, a lot more knowledgeable contributors that are able to really engage in the project, bring really good ideas together, and have those specialized discussions. And then secondly, you're going to also see much more I would say, engagement from the community to connect with the council members and say, okay, maybe I don't know anything about marketing and I'm not going to give feedback into those changes, but I know a lot about gaming. And here's my feedback on balance changes that we need to make for our products. Here's what we need to think about in terms of quality of life improvements versus new content that we're going to put out in the future. And this is an area that gamers really have been, I would say, hit pretty hard over the last 2 or 3 decades. Most gaming organizations and game development studios completely ignore their customers. They're
Mm.
focused purely on a data analytics driven model to extract as much revenue as they can out of their customers. And so
Mm.
quality of life improvements and changes that the community often wants to see are ignored in favor of, well, if we can extract another 1 cent per user per day if we do this one thing over here based on what our analytics team is telling us. And so trying to find the right balance of getting back to supporting the customers while still being profitable, that's where I think having those specialized councils is going to help Illuvium improve.
I mean, at the end of the day, people want a fun game, right?
Yes,
they wanna
yes.
have fun. They're not thinking analytics. They just wanna be in the environment, the Illuvium environment, the sandbox environment, and they just wanna have fun. So I can totally see that there needs to be a balance. Are there any DAOs out there that you know of that you look at and you say, you know what, they did it right and they're going to do great and they're
Mhm.
on that momentum?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think organizations like MakerDAO and Uniswap are a couple probably good examples. Synthetics is, I think, another one. I really like their DAO model. They also have kind of a multi-council model. And I would say these are DeFi protocols that have been around for a number of years. I think longevity is often underrated in the space, and it's easy to look at sort of the new kid on the block and say, "Oh, this is a great structure." But organizations that have stood the test of time and gone through several market cycles and still have a very functional DAO structure, good engagement from their communities, those are organizations that I think people should try to emulate. See, for each one, what are the key elements that made them work? And really then apply it to their own projects, because
Mhm.
no, in my mind, there are no two DAOs that should be structured exactly the same, because no two projects and no two organizations are set up with the exact same end goal and the same community members and the same
Mm.
products and so on. And so you need to take the basic framework and apply it in a way that's going to make sense for your organization to be able to succeed.
Any epic fails that we need to know of? Has anyone out there completely just got it wrong?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 points here that organizations typically fail. One is they don't focus on the technical side enough, and we talked earlier about hacks and exploits and vulnerabilities in the code. Um, Probably the most famous, at least early example in Web3 and crypto was an organization called the DAO, literally the DAO, and
Oh
they
yes,
had
I
a
remember that.
yeah, they had a cold vulnerability, and it
50
resulted in,
million, 50 billion, 50 billion or
yes,
50 million?
60 million, and yeah, $60 million
Yeah.
worth of ether that then the DAO went back and eventually forked. That happened because of one of the risks and the kind of negatives of DAOs, which is they're not fast. They're
Mm.
typically more effective, but they're not efficient. And so if you need to get votes in a hurry for a change to stop a vulnerability, and
Mhm.
you can't get enough of the community online to go vote for your proposal to make the change or whatever to the smart contract, it's really difficult because the smart contract is going to keep doing what it was told to do before. And so,
Mhm.
that risk of speed and adaptability is one that I think some organizations have failed. The
Yeah.
second one is I think falling prey to, I'm gonna say, the risk of pure democracy,
Mhm.
which is a lot of these organizations. I think whether it's through using quadratic voting or it's using representative structures, are better served, instead of one token equals one vote. you want to use some of these methods that allow you to get a better sense of the overall community sentiment for a topic. And that, again, that assists in decentralization. It assists also in specialization of knowledge in ways that are going to be more beneficial. And so other DAOs that have failed, I think, have taken that approach, and they've had, again, attackers, or they've had just communities that were overwhelmed by too many votes being held by a founder, and then all of a sudden it's not decentralized, and then the community leaves, and you're left with a token that has no utility because no one's there anymore, and you get these failed organizations. And so I think you want to understand why you have a DAO in the first place, and don't ever lose sight of that and move away from it just because it's more expedient to set up a simpler voting process, for instance.
And do you see, as we start to close here, do you see a future where we are incorporating DAOs into our business structures, not just in Web3, but even in more of our traditional ways of structuring?
Hmm. So I'm gonna answer this, and I'm gonna give another parallel. I think DAOs for me are similar to electric cars and
Mm.
autonomous driving, where the technology is good, there's tremendous amount of potential, and there's a whole lot of regulatory framework and infrastructure that still needs to be built out before it goes mainstream. So
Yeah.
I think the answer is yes. I think depending on what your time horizon is, you might think that my answer is wrong, but I would say if you're willing to give this thing another 7, 10, 12 years for the technology to continue to improve, for there to be more infrastructure around voting procedures and wallet security and onboarding of users and education, just like what you're doing on your channel, we need those elements to be in place first before we can really scale this. And we
Mhm.
also need the regulatory and legal frameworks to catch up. And that's the area that I have even less confidence in a short term solution, because every jurisdiction in the world is trying to figure out what they should be doing. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of consensus right now, and many of the regulators don't have any clue what this even is as a technology. And so I think we've got a
Yes.
little ways to go before we see this go mainstream. But I'm long term very bullish on DAOs becoming a key part of our everyday life, and I think they'll integrate with a lot of our Web2 companies over time. Um, I might be wrong in the adoption curve, right? It may end up being faster than I think, and so if it's under 10 years, I will be pleasantly surprised. I do think, though, you're going to start to see it just kind of gradually creep, and then eventually, when we get a couple high profile DAOs, Web2 organizations that implement a DAO within their framework, and jurisdictions that say, okay, we're gonna fully recognize DAOs, and here's what that means from a legal standpoint and from a regulatory standpoint. Then we're gonna see things start to speed up very quickly after that.
Exactly. Then the explosion will come.
Yes, that's right.
Just like the Web3 explosion. I mean,
Mhm.
clearly Annie is bullish when it comes to DAOs. I am bullish when it comes to DAOs. Let us know if you're bullish and if you have any questions, or there are any areas in this structure of DAOs that you want to learn more about. I know that we only covered basic information on DAOs today for our non-crypto natives, but Annie, I would love for us to get together again for another deep dive where we can maybe discuss specific DAO cases and whatever the audience need to know more about specific topics. So this is not going to be the last. And by the way, this is your first time coming on the show. I
It
just
is my
realized
first
that.
time on. Yes.
We do the gaming around. Well, wait, what is our show called? Why
Gaming
am
on the
I
block.
gaming around gaming on the block? Because I mix it up with Stash's metaverse around the
Yes.
metaverse. Yes.
Around the metaverse.
So we're on gaming on the block together, and we do that every other week, right?
That's right.
So
Yes.
we have a show coming up next week. I'm going to put that information in the note section so people can check us out there as well. But I hope this is not the last time that you're going to be on the show. I hope I can have more of you and knowledge, and I know the viewers want to as well. So I want to thank you for participating in the show today. It was so great to have you on.
Yeah, really my pleasure, Mona, as always. And I would look forward to coming back in the future. And that invitation extends both ways. I got to have you on
Thank you.
ANIMOS as well. And we can continue talking about how we grow Web3 to be what we know it can be in these next years to come. So thank you so much.
Of course, absolutely. And again, I'll put all the links in the note section so people can check you out. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on the latest episode of Metaverse Express Full Stop. I'm your host, Mona. Until next time.